Welcome to the Dear Rochester Retire Well podcast with David Pulcini from 6 Point Financial Partners. In this podcast, find your path towards a brighter financial future with David as your guide as he helps individuals, educators, and healthcare professionals explore ways they can build wealth while minimizing risk using a multifaceted, comprehensive approach to personal finance. Are you ready to take the first step towards a brighter financial tomorrow? Let's get started.
Folks, today we are going to talk about changing jobs, careers, pursuing a dream, starting a business, and it all ties back into what we are now calling the Great Recession. Today we have Nate with us. I want to talk about basically things like, what if you're scared to make the leap? And by the way, you're not the only one. What is holding you back from making that leap? Like I said, we have Nate. Nate is one of our great financial advisors at 6 Point. And I wanted to get him on the podcast because I know that he is seeing this quite a bit with his clients, and folks are asking Nate specifically a lot of questions about changing jobs. So Nate, how are you today, sir?
Doing awesome. How about you?
I'm doing great. So as a quick intro, how long have you been in financial planning and what got you into it?
Yeah, so I'll give you the short version of this. I've been doing this coming up on 6 years. I really got into it, Dave, because I kind of got into I've turned into a money nerd from my last job and career, actually. And I just wouldn't shut up about it to other people. And surprisingly enough, they were really receptive and interested. And, learning it myself before getting into this career, as well as seeing the difference it could make in other people's lives, was kind of addicting. And I'm still here.
Yeah, good for you. So I know we've talked a lot about this, and you're running into people of all ages, all income ranges, all sorts of different things. We see it all. So if you're listening to this as advisors, I feel like after 20 years of doing this, I've seen everything. Nate has specifically been running into folks looking to change jobs and they just don't know where to start or how to begin really making that change. And I wanted to have Nate on to talk about it because he has a checklist with us. So Nate, why don't we start with we'll call it the Great Resignation checklist, and let's just dive into what you would tell folks if they're considering making a move.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the spirit of continuing the theme, we've got 6 points for considering when it comes down to potentially joining and being part of the Great Resignation. So the first thing that I think it's always worth starting with, I get the question often, how do I go about doing this? How do I look at this? And I think how might be the wrong question. I think why is maybe the better question. So the first thing that I think everyone should consider when they're taking a look at another career is just to make sure that their expectations are aligned, especially if they're looking at potentially changing industries. So for instance, let me lay this out a little bit. So if their expectation is, Nate, I hate my job that I'm in right now. I want to go over here. I want to work part-time and I want to make $10,000 more than what I was making at my previous job. Maybe that's possible, but also maybe it's not. In fact, I'd probably lean on that it's probably not possible. So making sure that they're not setting themselves up to be disappointed and understanding, why are you really looking to leave? Is it because you feel like your purpose is not being fulfilled in your current role? It might be worth kind of examining that purpose a little bit, because I firmly believe that for the most part, you can find a way to fulfill that intrinsic need of purpose. I don't know if there's a better way to describe that. My one caveat to that is, if you're in a work environment that is exceptionally toxic, you probably need to find a way out, even if it's a little bit of a pay cut. Sometimes we can find ways to make this thing work, but your mental health, your emotional stability, your overall health really can be impacted in a negative way from just a really toxic work environment. Thankfully, not all of them are, but there are certainly a lot out there that is a really serious issue. And addition by subtraction is actually possible in that case.
Yeah. So I have a bunch of questions I can ask about that, but why don't we roll through the 6 points first, and then I'll ask some questions at the end. So
let's do it.
What's point number 2? I love
awesome.
The 6 points, by the way. Good for you.
You got it. Number 2 is, how does this move factor into your overall plan? So oftentimes I've found people considering a job change, for whatever reason, think that this is totally separate from their total financial game plan and picture. And it really couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, the foundation of really everything that we're using for planning purposes is the fact that there's an income coming from somewhere. So if we're talking about changing a job, we're now talking about changing the source of income, which really just means that we need to have at least a basic idea of how this is going to work. The first thing that's kind of a sub point of point number 2 here is, does this new role, does this new job allow you to leverage your current skill set to make more money or achieve a better work-life balance, which I think is maybe too much of a buzzword or phrase at this point. I kind of prefer work-life ratios, because I think the reality is most people are never going to be in a position where it's 50% work and 50% life. When you figure out what ratio you are comfortable with, I think you're setting yourself up more for success in those situations, to be happy with what you're working with, no pun intended. The second piece of that point is, looking at, does this new opportunity potentially have greater flexibilities that I may be able to employ here? So for instance, that could be a total remote work from home. This could be more of a hybrid schedule. Maybe it's Tuesday through Thursday, you're in the office, therefore, giving you more flexibility on the beginning and the end of the week. This works really well as far as like an addition to the equation here for especially younger families or growing families. They've got 9 kids that they're trying to pick up or bus to school. They've got a couple toddlers wandering around the house. They've got 3 dogs on top of it. There's a lot of complexities that come from just having a family. So having that kind of a hybrid or work from home role can help address some of that stuff. But there's also other benefits that I think come into play there too. So it's not just work from home. There are plenty of companies out there now that are offering things like unlimited paid time. I might get into unpacking that in a later podcast or conversation one-on-one, but it's a really interesting benefit. I think it does allow for a lot of flexibility. You've got things like pre-tax childcare savings, which I've seen several times now working with people in comparing benefits. And that is awesome, especially for people with young kids who maybe both spouses work, being able to kind of turn it into not quite a write-off, a deduction from their regular earnings is a big deal because childcare is so expensive. And then one that's relatively new in the grand scheme of things as well is there are some employers that are offering pre-tax student debt repayments, and they may also be assisting their employees with, whether it's $50 or $100 or whatever, whatever helps in order to start working on the bigger picture here. So there's a lot that goes into it, and it's not just isolated from the rest of your financial game plan. The income sources are so important.
I think a lot of people are wondering what unlimited pay time off means, but again, we'll get into that later. So
we can. I'd be happy to have a one-on-one conversation on that. Maybe it makes sense to make a whole podcast about that. I kind of doubt it, but it's an interesting benefit. I'll say that.
Well, I think if you're the employer, you're definitely looking for the right folks in that case, because you don't want to take advantage of it. So the right people won't. But so anyway, in the spirit of moving things on here, Nate, what do you have for the third point?
So point number 3 is professional development opportunities. I think this is, just like you described, maybe for those people who are really professionally driven. There are plenty of employers out there that will offer some kind of assistance or support. Now, I think the number one thing that comes to mind when people think of professional development is probably an employer assisting them with going back to school. Maybe they've got a bachelor's, they're looking to get a master's or a doctorate or what have you. And there are plenty of employers that will do that. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're encouraging you to go back to school, just to clarify. I would say that this is maybe a better opportunity for higher education if they're looking to subsidize that. If they are giving you a list of colleges that they have agreements and discounts for, maybe master's programs or MBAs. If they are giving you some sort of financial support to actually go back to college. Now, I do always want to mention this when people say, I'm looking for an employer that'll help me get my MBA. Be aware most employers that do that, not all, but most will want you to have some kind of agreement that you'll stay there for at least 3 years post getting your MBA. If they're investing in you, they don't want to see them invest in you and then you walk out the door. If you do decide to walk out the door and not follow that, oftentimes you do have to repay them for the amount that they were compensating you to get a higher education. But it doesn't just have to be degrees. There's plenty of purposes where getting leadership training might be extremely valuable. There's plenty of situations where getting some type of additional certificate that's relevant in your career field could be a really big deal. So I would say don't exclusively look at this as, well, I can't go get my MBA or I can't go get whatever degree you're pursuing and have my company pay for it. If they're looking for other ways to invest in you, it really could be a great opportunity, especially if it's something that maybe your current employer is not offering.
Right, which is the point of this, which I think may lead right into point number 4. You can see the title, but I don't know what you're going to talk about. So what are you gaining, right? Versus what are you giving up? And that might be one of the things, professional development. So
exactly
talk about that a little more.
It's exactly it. Just so this point doesn't seem redundant, it's got a bunch of subpoints to this. And the first segment of just these comparisons, gaining versus giving up, I tried to use as many of just the hard numbers, the numbers you could actually find that we could stack side by side and make comparisons to. When you're looking at increased earning potential, oftentimes I think that topic in and of itself is super appealing. In fact, I ran a poll prior to this podcast because I'm a nerd like that, and I enjoy hearing feedback from people. So it wasn't giant. There was 80 participants in this across 3 different LinkedIn groups, but 80% of these people said that the number one thing that they're assessing when they're looking at changing a job is salary. Am I going to get paid at least as much, if not more, if I go to a different place? That's the easy one. I think taking the job change process and saying, well, if the salary at the new place is better than the one that I've got right now, I'm making the change, is maybe oversimplifying it. That'd be like saying the only thing that a financial advisor does is keep track of rate of return. Right. Financial advising is so much more than just rate of return. The same as job change consideration should be way more than, is this new employer going to pay me more dollars on paper? Yeah. So to go along with that, though, I think if you are getting a significant pay bump, making sure you at least have a baseline understanding of the tax implications of this. Now, again, common misconception that I hear is some people have this perception that it's a flat tax rate and that if they get into that next bracket, that they're going to get taxed more on all the money that they've earned. You've already done a whole podcast on this, Dave. If you know which podcast number that is, feel free to reference that here for people so they can go back and check it out to get a better understanding of that. But
keep going, and then I'll let everybody know.
Yeah, absolutely. So just having a good understanding of that, I think, is helpful. So not because, hey, if I get a pay increase, I'm going to have less money to take home. That's likely not the situation, but it just may not be as rich as it looks when you realize what percentage of that money, especially in the higher tax brackets as you climb the ladder, is actually getting taken out for state and federal taxes. It's also important, I think, especially for people who are married filing jointly, to really understand how it combines. It's not just their income that it's affecting, it's them and their spouse. So taking a look at the full household, I think, is really important there as well. I think it's also really important. One of the number one costs that people are concerned about is healthcare. What are my health insurance premiums going to be? What does it cover? Oftentimes, and I've seen this firsthand, I can think of 3 instances right off the top of my head with clients as we went through and did some reviews on this. The new employer was offering them a significantly better salary, but they were also going to be in a situation where the health insurance was not nearly as generous, I guess we'll say. And on top of that, they didn't actually have the same style of health plan that they had at their last employer. So there was a bunch of additional changes that they had to take into account. But ideally, seeing if you can compare comparable plans side by side and understanding what your deductibles are. If you do decide to choose a high deductible plan, which not all, but many people do you still have maybe an HSA, or is there an HSA available at the new employer that you didn't have at your previous one? Again, finding tax efficient ways to save for future healthcare expenses, I think, is a big deal, just the same way that it is for pre-tax childcare savings. You're likely going to spend some money on it at some point. We might as well make sure you do it in the most efficient way possible. The third sub point to what you might be gaining from moving to a new employer here is you really want to understand the matching requirements and kind of how that works. So making a comparison side by side is important, but there's a little hidden piece to it that I find a lot of people just disregard. And it's that there might be a waiting period at their new employer. So let's say it's an extremely generous offer, the matching is wonderful, but you've got to wait 6 months or a year. Now, it's not a deal breaker in the most cases, but we just can't count that as additional value to your compensation for the first year at the very least. And we need to make sure that when you're making this move, your intention is being there long enough to really reap the rewards of it. Yeah. Whether it's profit sharing, whether it's a match to your retirement plan, it's good to have a handle on what's going on there. The other side of the coin here, maybe money you're leaving on the table here. So some things to consider before you make the jump from a current employer. One of my biggest pet peeves for myself and others is missing out on free money that's available. So I always do my best to try and make sure that anytime there is something that resembles that people take advantage of it, and I help them do. An example of this might be not understanding the vesting schedule for your previous employer. And again, I can think of easily 2 or 3 right off the top of my head where the vesting schedule, for those that are unfamiliar with that term, it's basically a calculation built into a 401k or employer-sponsored plan that has a certain percentage associated with it. AKA, if you stay at your employer for 1 year, 25% of the money that they've matched you is yours if you leave. 2 years, 50%, 3 years, 75%, and so on. And in this case, it was that same schedule. So 75% of the money his employer had matched, which was a very generous match based on the percentage he was working with before. We were about 4.5 months from him being fully vested. And he did decide to take the new job, which was, again, a higher salary. But it was nice because I've seen it happen as a surprise to people in the past, usually people that I'm not working with and start working with me. But, he knew exactly how much he was going to be leaving on the table and decided, you know what, this move is worth. I'm glad that wasn't a surprise. So being aware of all that stuff, there's a lot that goes into this, but that's maybe one of the number one points here. I'm trying not to ramble too long on this, but making sure that if there is a period of 6 months or longer at that new employer that you're waiting, again, just be aware of. Maybe a lesser considered piece is with those who are participating in group life or disability plans through their current employers. You want to make sure you've got something relatively comparable with the new employer. I think it's a great, really, this is a big deal for younger families typically, but especially if you can't qualify on your own, typically I'm a big proponent of making sure that you're in control of that. But if you can't qualify, making sure that either A, your group plan for both of those is portable, B, understanding how it's portable, meaning do you have to go back and qualify by medical? If you may not be able to actually get qualified that way because of some health condition, getting an idea of if your new employer offers, again, similar or same benefits allows you to make sure you don't have big gaps of insurance coverage throughout the transition process.
Yeah, I mean, that point alone it's extremely thorough, first of all, but I think I just thought of the next paper that I want you to write, Nate, and it's going to be called something like how your $100,000 job pays you less than your current $80,000 job or something like that. That's the point of all of this wrapped up, right? So,
yep.
And again, some people chase the salary and then the bottom line dollars in their bank account may actually be less because of all these things you mentioned. And if you're listening, most people aren't considering all of these things. Maybe they don't even know. Maybe sometimes they just say, you know what, I'm going to get paid more over here. I'm out. I'm sick of this place anyway. So, but these are all definitely things. If you're doing a very thorough job, which Nate is doing, these are things you want to consider. So we are on point number 5, Nate.
We are. So point number 5 is, like I said, this is going to sound redundant. What am I gaining versus what am I giving up? But I wanted to split these up because this is more of the softer side. All of those things we just talked about in point number 4 are pretty quantifiable. You can grab the number, you can make a comparison side by side. This one is a little bit more subjective. What am I gaining? You might be looking at increased flexibility. It's a very common trend that we're seeing when people are saying, look, I'm looking for a new job. I want to be able to work from home. I want to be able to split my time between the home and office. So one of the things that really can be big about increased flexibility, especially if it's a remote or work from home job, is you may really be able to reduce your travel time, especially right now. As the date that we're recording this, gas prices are still, not cheap. So being able to put less into the tank on a weekly basis is pretty attractive for people. But even ignoring the dollar aspect of it, the amount of time, especially if you're living in a larger city, your commute might be 45 minutes to an hour pretty easily one way. So this situation, I think, can give you a lot of extra time back in your day, which there's actually been several studies that have kind of walked through the increased time back in your schedule that isn't used with transit creates a situation where you can have a lot more creativity in your role. That actual time to sit there and ponder and come up with unique ideas really can be a big asset for not just you and your role, but the company that you're employed with as well. And I think a lot of people are in love with the idea of the increased autonomy, like making your own schedule, being your own boss. Touch on that because I think that's a catch-22 for a lot of people. But making your own schedule, I think, is a big flexibility piece that a lot of people long for. The other side of the coin here, what you might be giving up, is I think with increased flexibility, oftentimes comes increased complexity. So when you look at this, I don't know if this is actually a term, but this is just how it always made sense in my mind. I call it a blended schedule, meaning that when you're working remote from home, you might be taking a phone call with a fellow employee or coworker, and you're changing the laundry over, or you're putting the dishes away, or you're making sure the dog gets outside. It's that in and of itself, I think some people are sitting there saying, oh, I'd love to do that. I'll tell you right now, as someone who through the entire pandemic worked from home and continues to do a decent amount of work remote, maybe romanticized a little much. It's not as cool as you think it is after that becomes your norm. For the first couple weeks, it might be very cool. But I think and there were, again, plenty of articles written about this, especially during the pandemic, but the increased complexity, now that you're working completely remote or mostly remote, do you want to have your desk in your bedroom? Is that going to be the best setup? Do you want to have your desk be the kitchen table? So you have to set it up and tear it down every single night to make sure that there's plenty of room for the kids to still eat at the kitchen table, because you're trying to keep them away from the TV anyways. At the end of the day, there's some increased complexity there, because now you have to figure out a whole other space in your house. Separating those two things, work and life, really does create a better situation from a psychological perspective for people. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but that whole 9 to 5, it's kind of no longer a thing. If you're working from home using a blended schedule, it's figure out when you can get the work done. And as someone who works for themselves, all the advisors here at 6 Point, we run our own books independently. I'm my own boss. And at the end of the day, I'm probably way harder on myself than any other boss that I've ever had has ever been. Careful what you wish for.
That's right. So back to the first part of the point number 5, the reduced travel time. We have to be careful there, Nate, because 80% of our listeners listen to this podcast in the car. So you just reduced more than half of the people that are going to hear this, right? If they stay home. But the blended schedule thing, I love that. Integrated schedule, blended schedule. I have not heard that before or thought about it as clearly as what you just said, but I think it's completely accurate. I personally definitely need to leave to focus. Otherwise, I'll be sitting there thinking about, are my dishes done? Is that laundry switched? Oh, I could go clean this off real quick, or take the dog out. And it's definitely need a separate workspace for me personally. And I totally agree with you. Romanticized. I try to work from an office as much as possible, but we are on to our last point here, Nate, and then we'll wrap it up on point number 6. So we can talk about that a little bit.
Yep. Number 6 is create some guardrails to protect you from you. So there's a handful of points on this. I think as we look at increased salary numbers on that offer letter, we tend to be predisposed to start thinking of all of the things that we couldn't afford before that we can now afford. And we're starting to spend the money before we actually have it. So I've got 3 points to this. How do we make sure that we don't kind of go down this slippery slope? I think number 1, it's important to keep the focus on paying yourself first before inflating your lifestyle. I know we were just discussing this recently, but I've read in multiple places that walking through the process of getting big salary jumps throughout your career versus having a relatively gradually growing or even similar salary throughout your career, you tend to notice that people who get big jumps sometimes don't do as good a job as those who have consistent salaries or numbers by the end of their career, looking back at what they've saved. So there's something to that. Number 2, I think as you walk through a increased salary situation, having a cash flow plan that includes the things that you want to do that are fun, the luxuries that you'd like to see, how you can afford, which again, I think maybe that's the right phrase. Not if we can afford it, how can we afford it? Creating those different creative ways to figure out the answer to the question. Because if is a yes or no, how is, there's multiple different iterations of that. And then number 3, I think it makes good sense, selfish plug, to employ a professional. It doesn't have to be me, to employ a professional to help you determine how you can balance the fun parts with the new job and the raise with the reality of making sure you're staying the course or getting on course to being able to retire and live the life that you want to be able to live long term. So yes, that's what I've got for point 6.
Yeah, I like it. I was just thinking we did a sudden wealth podcast too, and I can equate somebody getting an $80,000 job promoted to a $200,000 job, but then they went and bought a new house and a brand new car.
Yep.
And they're back to making the same or even less than what they were making with the 80,000. So, and if folks are listening to this saying you definitely know somebody that has done that. They got a new job and they went out and spent that difference. As an advisor, it's easy for us to say, right, Nate? Like it's very easy for us to say, well, you should just say that. Live like you were for the next 4 years and you'll be set. But it's easier said than done, right?
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
One thing I don't think we have time for this today, but I wanted to bring this up is this is more of a job to job change, right? Or career to career change. And I'll call it it's not a lateral move, but you know what I mean? Maybe a promotion or from one similar employment to another employment, like a nurse moving from one hospital to another hospital or something. This is certainly all stuff they should go through. One thing that I noticed that people really ask about is like, again, what should I do? And they look at the salary. So 80%, I was surprised it was 80%. I look for different things, but that's just me personally, freedom, flexibility, all that stuff. But it is interesting to see that 80%. And that's true. That's the real world. Are you going to make more money? That's the first thing people do. Now, with that said, going through what Nate just covered was that actually doesn't always mean you're making more money just because there's a larger number on paper. So that's something to go through. The second part of this, though, and again, we don't have time for this today, is what about like the side hustle or the dream job or the running your own business? So I run into this all the time. Teachers or nurses or doctors or somebody that has something that they want to pursue that almost has nothing to do with what they're doing, but they know they want to do this business. They just don't know when to make the leap.
Yeah.
A lot of these principles can apply. And I've walked a number of people through that exact scenario. And at the end of the day, and I think Nate would agree with this, is many times if you've got the financials set, which obviously financial advisors can help with, then it just comes down to just going with the gut, right? Bank on yourself, go with your gut. Do you think it's going to work? Many folks are very, very nervous to do this. And I get it, to pursue that entrepreneurial dream because they don't know. And if you're making $50, $100, $200, $300,000 to walk away from that to bank on yourself, that's a big leap. So this is stuff that's all considered with what Nate's talking about. So Nate, I know you've been working on a tool that you're going to get out to folks to kind of calculate some of this. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I'll give just a sneak peek. As I was putting together this checklist, it became very obvious that there was no way in a single podcast episode we'd be able to lay everything out so that people could just do it on their own. And I know that most people are visual as well. So I think it really prompted how can we create more of a side-by-side with visuals to take all of these different things, walk people through the questions that maybe they should be asking their hiring manager or the recruiter that they're, conversing with, to really get an idea. It stinks to get into a new role that you were really excited about, and then to see all the gotchas. Oh, you didn't ask me about that. Oh, we never mentioned that. So just having as clear of an image of where you're going. I know there's always a little bit of stress or anxiety when you're making a change of any kind. Let's shine the light a little further down that path to make sure that people have a better idea what they're getting into. So yeah, we're really excited to put that out, but that should be available in the near future. I'm sure we'll make plenty of announcements once it is. And we're excited to use it to help people make good decisions.
I love it. And again, if you haven't done this before, or even if you have, sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. Nate, how can folks get a hold of you if they want to get that tool, or even just talk to you about all the things that we discussed today?
Yeah. I mean, there's a handful of places you can find me. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so feel free to find me on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me by email at nhasto@sixpointfp.com, or you can find me on our website. And there are plenty of different things you can look up, look into, or read about if you're interested.
Pretty much searching Nate Hasto, Rochester, New York will work. So
yep, it will.
Thanks for your time, Nate. We appreciate it. Folks, if you want to check us out, www.sixpointfp.com. You can find me, David Pulcini, on LinkedIn as well. And also our Facebook page that we're putting more and more information out on. So for now, that's it. Nate, we appreciate it again. We'll have you back on. And folks, make it a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Dear Rochester Retire Well podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of 6 Point Financial Partners. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.
Securities offered through American Portfolios Financial Services, Inc., APFS, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through American Portfolios Advisors, Inc., APA, an SEC-registered investment advisor. 6 Point Financial is not affiliated with APFS and APA. This material is for informational purposes only. Neither APFS nor its representatives provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. Please consult your own tax, legal, or accounting professional before making any decisions.